Across the long memory of human warfare, there are moments when the dust of marching feet and the thunder of hooves are not merely the sound of numbers, but the echo of a single mind bending chaos toward an improbable victory. Conquest is often pictured as the work of brute force, of larger armies and heavier weapons, yet history's deepest scars were carved by something far more subtle and far more terrifying: ideas. Ideas about movement and surprise, about fear and timing, about how to break the will of an enemy before steel ever touches flesh. To follow the paths of Alexander of Macedon, Hannibal of Carthage, Genghis Khan of the Steppe, and Napoleon of France is to walk through a chain of evolutions in the art of conquest. 4 storms separated by centuries, each learning different truths about how to make an army move like a thought and strike like a verdict. Their worlds were different, their weapons different, their gods and languages different, yet in the way they read terrain, weighed morale, and gambled with time, they seemed to be speaking a secret language only great captains ever truly understand. Alexander's world was an ancient tapestry of stone cities, walled plains and narrow seas, where Greek city-states argued and fought beneath bright skies and Persian kings ruled from palaces heavy with incense and gold. Into this world came a small northern kingdom, Macedon, hard and rough, its hills raising horsemen and infantry who were more used to sweat and earth than to marble and debate. Philip, the king who forged Macedon into a spear, reshaped its army into a machine that could lock shields and push forward like a moving wall, but it was his son Alexander who would take that machine and turn it into a bolt of lightning. Alexander understood something few before him had grasped so completely: that speed, concentration of force, and decisive engagement could shatter even empires if applied with unrelenting precision. He inherited from his father not only formations and weapons, but a new way of thinking about how to use them. The Macedonian phalanx, with its forest of long pikes, could anchor a line that would not break, yet Alexander never allowed his army to become a static anvil. He moved his men with a rapidity that stunned contemporaries, crossing mountains and deserts in marches that seemed to ignore exhaustion, driving them always toward the decisive point where he intended to meet the enemy's heart, not its edges. When he led his forces across the narrow waters into Asia, the Persians expected another slow Greek expedition like those they had faced generations earlier. What they met instead at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela was a storm. Alexander read the battlefield like a living map, feeling where the enemy was strong and where they were vulnerable, then concentrated force with ruthless focus at that weakness. At Issus, trapped between mountains and sea, he refused to be pinned. He anchored his phalanx on the rough ground, absorbed the Persian attack, and then hurled his elite cavalry at the point that would open a path toward the royal chariot. At Gaugamela, faced with a Persian army that outnumbered him across a wide plain, he did not spread his troops in a thin imitation of that breadth. Instead, he created depth, allowing gaps to open, drawing sections of the Persian line out of alignment, then pivoted and struck into the exposed center. The speed of his decision-making turned space itself into a weapon. Though his men carried spears and swords, the real cutting edge was his ability to compress time, to act faster than his opponent could process. The enemy was caught reacting to what he had already decided, fighting the last formation while he was already creating another. For Alexander, morale was not an afterthought, but a primary weapon. He appeared where the fighting was fiercest, riding at the very front, making himself visible in his distinctive armor so that friend and foe alike knew where he was. To his men, this was a promise that he would share their peril, and that promise translated into an energy that drove them through heat and exhaustion. To his enemies, seeing the same figure again and again at the heart of the attack was like watching a symbol of inevitability ride toward them. Fear spread even before contact. Rumors of the speed of his marches, of the way his army appeared unexpectedly across rivers and ridges, of the way his phalanx refused to break while his cavalry pierced like a lance, all undermined resistance before the first spear was thrown. In his hands, concentration of force meant more than piling men in one place. It meant concentrating surprise, morale, and clarity of purpose upon a single objective, often the enemy commander himself, until the structure of their army dissolved around that missing center. When Alexander burned Persepolis, the Persian capital, he was also burning an old world of warfare. Behind him lay a trail of shattered armies that had been beaten not only in the clash, but in their inability to imagine an enemy who moved so quickly and aimed so directly at decisive battle. Yet conquest never belongs to one man or one age. Centuries later, beyond the western horizon of Alexander's roots, Rome rose around its forum and its legions marched in steady rhythm across the Mediterranean world. The Roman Republic, with its discipline and its grim persistence, crushed one opponent after another until it met a mind that refused to fight on Roman terms. That mind belonged to Hannibal Barca of Carthage. Where Alexander exploited speed and concentration, Hannibal refined deception and encirclement to a terrifying art. As a child, he had grown up in the shadow of his father's struggles against Rome and Sicily and Spain. The memory of defeat, of harsh peace terms and Roman expansion, burned into him a hatred that was not only emotional, but strategic. He understood that Carthage could not defeat Rome by matching it in straightforward battles on Italian soil, with equal numbers and straightforward tactics. Rome's strength was in resilience, in the ability to absorb losses and raise new armies. To break such an opponent, one had to crack not only their formations, but their confidence in their own invincibility. Hannibal's journey across the Alps was itself a strategic message. Instead of accepting the sea as Rome's domain and fighting in Spain or Africa, he chose a route that most believed impossible. His army, with its multicultural mix of infantry, cavalry, and elephants, climbed into snow and ice along narrow paths where one misstep meant death. Men froze, animals slipped, rocks tumbled, and entire sections of the column disappeared into ravines. Yet the survivors emerged into Italy like a legend made flesh, the Alps at their backs, Roman expectations shattered. He had attacked not just a frontier, but an assumption. In the first clashes on Italian soil, at the Ticinus and the Trebia, Hannibal tested his understanding of Roman psychology. He knew Roman consuls were ambitious, eager for glory and impatient of caution. He offered them bait, delaying actions, apparent weakness, opportunities to charge. At Lake Trasimene, he led a Roman army along a lakeside road hemmed in by hills and water. Hidden on the slopes, his troops waited while fog curled along the lake's surface. When the Romans were fully inside the trap, he sprang it. From the hills, Carthaginian forces descended on their flank and rear. The lake blocked retreat. Confusion, not numbers, did the work. The Roman column disintegrated in panic. The battle was decided long before most of the Romans even saw their attackers clearly. At Cannae, Hannibal reached the apex of his art. On a broad, dusty plain of Apulia, he faced a Roman army that outnumbered him, drawn up in dense blocks of infantry that intended to crush his center with sheer weight. Hannibal deployed his forces in a subtle curve, placing his weaker infantry in the middle, his more reliable troops behind them, and his excellent cavalry on the wings. When the Romans advanced, their massive center pressed forward, driving the Carthaginian middle back, apparently as planned by Roman doctrine. But as the center bent and retreated, it did not break. Hannibal's line folded in upon itself, drawing the Roman mass deeper into a narrowing pocket. On the wings, his cavalry defeated the Roman horse, then wheeled inward and struck the Roman rear. What had been a straight Roman line became a trapped knot, surrounded on all sides by Carthaginian infantry and cavalry. Dust rose in choking clouds, screams were muffled by the press of bodies, and the Roman army, pinned so tightly that many could not even lift their arms, was annihilated. Hannibal had achieved what commanders dream of and rarely attain: the complete destruction of a larger force through patient shaping of the battlefield and careful manipulation of enemy expectations. Deception, for him, was not a trick played at the last moment. It was baked into every march, every camp, every feint. He studied the tendencies of Roman commanders, learned how they responded to insults and opportunities, and then built traps that relied as much on their character as on his deployment. In this way, he showed that conquest is as psychological as it is physical. He understood that the battlefield begins in the mind of the enemy commander, long before the ground is chosen. Where Alexander overwhelmed with speed and shock, Hannibal lured and strangled letting his adversary walk willingly into encirclement. If Alexander's genius shone greatest at the moment of decisive charge, Hannibal's brilliance lay in the hours and days before, in the quiet movements that made one valley or one plain an invisible noose. Yet even his feats could not erase the structural strength of Rome, whose political machine and manpower reserves eventually turned the tide when Carthage failed to support him fully and when the Romans themselves learned, painfully, from him. In another time, in another landscape entirely, a different kind of conqueror rose whose strategies would stretch across whole continents like an invisible net. The Eurasian steppe, with its endless grasses and distant horizons, shaped the mind of Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan. Here, where the sky is vast and trees are scarce, where winter wind slashes across the plains and summer storms roll in like walls, survival depended on mobility and information. The nomadic tribes that roamed this space fought perpetual skirmishes over pasture land, herds, and honor. Horses were not simply tools of war, they were the legs of life itself. Genghis Khan's first conquests were not of foreign empires, but of his own divided people. By unifying the Mongol and other steppe tribes under his rule, he created a core of warriors drilled in the old ways of mounted archery, but organized in a new, rational structure. Units were grouped by tens, hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands, breaking the old tribal divisions. Loyalty was redirected from clan to Khan. Merit, not only blood, became a path to command. This reorganization allowed him to deploy his armies like a flexible organism rather than a patchwork of competing warbands. His real revolution, however, came in how he used mobility, intelligence, and psychological warfare as integrated tools. Mongol warriors could ride for days, changing horses to keep their mounts fresh, covering distances that sedentary armies considered impossible. Scouts swept far ahead, mapping terrain, counting enemy forces, identifying water sources and vulnerabilities. Messengers rode between units using a relay system that allowed information to flash across hundreds of miles with startling speed. In the days before telegraph and radio, the Mongol communication network functioned like a central nervous system connecting far-flung limbs. When Genghis Khan turned his gaze toward the sedentary civilizations to the south and west, from the Jin dynasty in northern China to the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, he brought this mobile intelligence apparatus to bear on opponents still thinking within the horizons of fixed fortresses and slow-moving foot armies. He did not simply march straight lines toward capitals. He split his forces, sending columns along different axes, confusing defenders who tried to guess his main thrust. He used feigned retreats at a scale and with a discipline that turned an old trick into a science. His troops would attack, then apparently break and flee. Pursuing forces, tasting what they thought was victory, would rush after them in disordered pursuit, only to be drawn out of formation and into terrain where hidden Mongol reserves enveloped them. Like Hannibal, he mastered encirclements, but he did so at operational and even strategic scales, destroying not only armies, but the very capacity of states to resist. Terror was a deliberate part of his strategy. When cities resisted and then were taken, he sometimes ordered large-scale slaughter and destruction. News of these events traveled faster than his armies, carried by refugees and rumors. As a result, other cities, hearing that resistance might mean annihilation, sometimes surrendered at once, opening their gates and begging for mercy. This spared his forces prolonged sieges and allowed him to move on quickly. Yet terror alone does not explain his success. Where resistance was minimal or surrender early, he could be pragmatic, sparing lives, recruiting artisans and engineers, and incorporating useful administrators. He recognized that to control trade routes and extract tribute, he needed functioning societies, not endless wastelands. Information flowed both ways, from scouts to generals, from spies embedded in foreign courts back to the Khan. He exploited political divisions within enemy realms, supporting one faction against another, appearing as liberator to some while striking others. His capacity to coordinate distant campaigns, with multiple columns converging on an enemy from unexpected directions, represented a new scale of operational flexibility. Under his leadership, the gap between a decision taken in a felt tent on the steppe and the thunder of hooves at a besieged city's gate shrank dramatically, Like Alexander and Hannibal, he understood that fear and expectation shape battle outcomes as much as steel. The sight of a Mongol vanguard on the horizon, the knowledge that they could appear again days later far away, the stories of encircled armies who vanished under arrow storms, all gnawed at the morale of those who opposed him. Many battles were lost in the councils of nervous kings before a single Mongol arrow was loosed. Where Alexander compressed time at the level of the single battle and campaign, and Hannibal twisted Roman habits against them in a specific theater, Genghis Khan compressed time and space at the scale of continents, using speed and information to ensure that potential coalitions against him never had time to form or coordinate. In his wake, the map of Eurasia was redrawn, not only in borders, but in the very pathways of trade and communication. His strategies, born of the steppe, proved lethal against stone walls and ancient dynasties alike. Centuries after his death, another figure would rise in Europe who seemed to gather elements from all three of his predecessors and reforge them in the age of gunpowder and revolution. Napoleon Bonaparte inherited a France that had overthrown its king and was surrounded by monarchies that feared and hated its new order. The armies he first commanded were not the professional mercenary forces of old Europe, but mass levies fired by ideology, chaotic yet full of energy. From this raw material, he forged instruments of war that could march faster and endure more than many of their opponents. His true genius, however, did not lie merely in inspiration or courage, but in how he reinvented operational warfare. Napoleon divided his forces into corps, semi-independent formations composed of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, each capable of marching separately, fighting for a time alone if necessary, and then combining with others at decisive points. Instead of dragging a single massive army along one road, he spread his corps across a wide front, moving along parallel routes. This allowed his forces to live off a broader swath of land, avoiding the crippling supply bottlenecks that had slowed many earlier armies. More importantly, it allowed him to mask his intentions. An enemy facing reports of multiple French corps advancing on different axes struggled to discern where the main effort would fall. Napoleon could then rapidly concentrate his corps at the chosen point, turning dispersed columns into a unified fist. The moral effect of this practice was similar to the shock Alexander created when he struck swiftly at the enemy center, but Napoleon achieved it through days of marching and feints rather than a single charge. At Ulm in 1805, he encircled an Austrian army without a major battle by moving his corps around it in a wide arc, crossing the Danube where they were not expected, and sealing off escape. The Austrian commander found himself trapped, his lines of retreat severed, his army surrounded by forces that had seemed scattered only days before. It was a campaign of movement and deception that anticipated annihilation without the annihilating slaughter of Cannae. At Austerlitz, facing Russian and Austrian forces, Napoleon again used terrain, deception, and timing to win before the first volleys were exchanged. He occupied a position that appeared weak on one flank, inviting his enemies to attack there. Confident that they had found his vulnerability, the coalition commanders shifted troops in that direction. Napoleon, watching their movements, saw their center thin. On the day of battle, beneath a cold, bright sky and the pale light glinting from frozen ponds, he held back until the enemy was fully committed to the flank attack. Then he struck through the mist rising from the ground, sending his reserves into the weakened center, splitting the Allied army in two and rolling it up like fabric. The ponds into which soldiers fled became icy graves. The battle gave him not only tactical victory, but psychological dominance over Europe's old regimes. Napoleon's manipulation of tempo was relentless. He often moved his armies in bad weather, when enemies assumed campaigning was impossible. He crossed rivers in floods, marched through snow, and chose roads others avoided. His enemies tried to organize coalitions, but he attacked each in turn before they could fully combine, applying a principle similar to Alexander's concentration of force and Genghis Khan's disruption of potential alliances. He aimed to defeat armies in detail, choosing when and where to fight so that he rarely faced the full strength of his opponents at once. Even his use of artillery was strategic, not merely tactical. He massed guns at crucial points, creating zones of fire that shattered enemy formations, just as his infantry and cavalry were poised to exploit the break. These thunderous barrages not only tore gaps in lines, but shook morale. the psychological experience of listening to French guns methodically pound positions into dust, knowing an assault would follow, wore down resistance before bayonets arrived. Throughout his campaigns, Napoleon exploited human factors as ruthlessly as geography. He understood hunger and fatigue as weapons. His men marched hard, but he demanded even more of his enemies by forcing them into rapid movements they had not planned. He exploited vanity, leaking false information or allowing enemy spies to overhear what he wanted them to hear. He timed proclamations and gestures to influence public opinion and the morale of allied states. To his soldiers, he became a symbol, much like Alexander to his phalangites, a personification of chance and genius combined, and that image multiplied his effectiveness. The mere rumor that Napoleon himself was on the field could unsettle opposing troops who remembered stories of his previous victories. When viewed together, the strategies of Alexander, Hannibal, Genghis Khan, and Napoleon form not four separate tales, but a single evolving narrative about conquest as a mental art. All four understood that battles are often decided long before the first clash, in the arrangement of forces, in the choice of ground, in the manipulation of information, in the shaping of expectations and fear. Alexander used the speed of his marches and the coherence of his army to seize the initiative and choose decisive engagements. Hannibal accepted that he could not match Rome's resources and therefore turned Roman strength into weakness, letting their aggressiveness drag them into elaborate traps. Genghis Khan saw that in a world of slow communications, the side that mastered information and movement would always seem to strike from everywhere at once. Napoleon recognized that in an age of large national armies and gunpowder, the ability to move semi-independent corps swiftly and then mass them at chosen points could overwhelm enemies still thinking in rigid linear deployments. Common to them all was an understanding of fear, fatigue, and hope. They knew that soldiers exhausted by forced marches can still fight if they believe they are close to a decisive victory, while troops dragged endlessly from place to place with no clear purpose will falter. They knew that surprise can shatter courage in a heartbeat, that a sudden flank attack or an unexpected appearance of forces in the rear can cause even disciplined troops to waver. They knew that killing the enemy's belief in their own leadership is as important as killing the enemy's bodies. Alexander's direct assaults on Persian kings, Hannibal's destruction of consular armies, Genghis Khan's relentless pursuit of fleeing rulers, and Napoleon's humiliation of coalition commanders all aimed at breaking that intangible core of confidence around which armies rally. The landscapes they fought on became familiar stages for these psychological dramas. The plains of Gaugamela, the fog-bound shore of Lake Trasimene, the open steppes of Central Asia, and the river valleys and crossroads of Central Europe all were more than backdrops. They were instruments. Terrain offered avenues for ambush and encirclement, platforms for speeding columns, barriers that could herd armies into kill zones or shield surprise marches. These men read terrain not as a map of obstacles, but as a script they could rewrite. They used deserts, forests, mountains, and rivers as actors in their strategies, casting them as concealment, as trap, as funnel, as wall. Dust clouds on the horizon were signals to them, revealing not only where an enemy was, but how fast he was moving and how tired he might be. Storms and snow were not always reasons to stop. Sometimes they were cloaks under which bold maneuvers could be hidden. In all of this, the human mind remained the ultimate deciding factor. Weapons changed from spears and swords to composite bows and siege engines, from muskets to cannons, but the core questions of conquest stayed the same. How do you move men and animals and supplies faster than the enemy expects? How do you mask your intentions while discovering his? How do you strike where he is weak and force him to commit where he thinks he is strong? How do you use fear without becoming its slave? How do you maintain discipline and belief among your own while eroding it in the other? Alexander, Hannibal, Genghis Khan, and Napoleon each answered these questions in ways that stunned their contemporaries and that still occupy the minds of soldiers and historians today. Modern technology has extended the reach and speed of war, overlaying satellites and drones, aircraft and missiles onto the old fields. Yet, in the war colleges of nations, their campaigns are still plotted on maps, their marches traced, their decisions analyzed. Students still ask why Alexander chose to refuse a flank, why Hannibal allowed his center to bend, why Genghis split his forces and sent them along separate routes, why Napoleon risked so much on the timing of his corps at Austerlitz or Jena. They find that the core answers lie not in the particular weapons, but in the quality of judgment that could hold many variables in a single mind and then act quickly, decisively, without guarantee. No machine yet has replaced that leap. Algorithms can model logistics and predict probabilities, but they cannot feel the weight of hesitation in an enemy's counsel, cannot smell rising panic across a plain, cannot sense when an army is ripe to break or when it will hold. Conquest, at its most chilling and most awe-inspiring, remains a human art. In the end, the greatest conquest strategies ever used are not merely techniques to be copied. They are manifestations of a relationship between a commander and uncertainty. Alexander stood at the edge of known maps and rode beyond, convinced that the risk was worth the possibility of a single decisive blow against empire. Hannibal watched Roman legions march like iron rivers and chose to divert them into carefully prepared whirlpools. Genghis Khan looked across a continent of walled cities and scattered kingdoms and saw not impassable barriers, but a chessboard on which mobility and terror could outrun fortification. Napoleon surveyed a Europe of slow armies and rigid lines and imagined an instrument made of fast-moving, independent parts that could converge with the force of a hammer. They were all, in different ways, storytellers who wrote with armies instead of words, shaping narratives of expectation and shock in the minds of their enemies. Their victories and their ultimate defeats remind us that the same qualities that make conquest possible also contain seeds of overreach. The will that dares to compress time and defy odds can also push too far. The confidence that allows a commander to gamble intelligently can harden into arrogance. Alexander's empire shattered after his death, unable to hold the speed of his advance in stable form. Hannibal, unmatched on the battlefield, could not overcome Carthage's political limitations and Rome's deep reserves. Genghis Khan's empire, though more structurally robust, eventually fragmented under the weight of its vastness and internal divisions. Napoleon's brilliance dazzled Europe for a decade, then led him into the snows of Russia and the long grind of coalitions that learned his methods and turned them against him. Yet perhaps it is precisely because their strategies walk this knife edge between genius and catastrophe that they continue to fascinate. They show, in stark relief, what the disciplined imagination of one person can unleash upon the world, for good and ill. They demonstrate that while numbers and technology matter, they are inert until animated by minds that dare to see differently. Even today, when commanders plan operations on screens glowing with data, when missiles fly beyond the horizon and satellites watch from unblinking heights, the lessons of these ancient and early modern storms remain. Choose the decisive point. Move faster than expectation. Deceive where the enemy is sure. Strike where fear already lives. Respect the terrain. Understand the human heart. Above all, remember that no matter how advanced the tools, the outcome still hinges on judgment, imagination, and will. In the dust that still lies on the plains of Gaugamela, in the mist that sometimes clings to Lake Trasimene, in the wind that sweeps the old Mongol paths on the steppe, in the quiet fields around Austerlitz, echoes remain of armies that once marched to the rhythm of such minds. Their banners have fallen, their empires have cracked, but their strategies continue to march forward, invisible yet present. In every serious thought about how wars are really won and why, in the shadow of all our machines, the human spirit still stands at the center of conquest.